Late one night, I found myself on a lonely stretch of highway, a road I'd taken countless times before, familiar, or so I thought. I had just dropped off a passenger from a late flight. He was a quiet guy with no small talk, just a simple thanks, and that was it. He stepped out of the car and disappeared into the dark. I thought nothing of it. As I pulled away from the driveway, I noticed something unusual. A car, dark, unmarked, driving ahead of me. At first I thought maybe it was just another lost driver, but then it moved differently, slowly, almost too slowly. I watched it for a second. It felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I had this uneasy feeling like someone was watching me. I switched lanes to pass it. It was a narrow road, and I was just trying to get home. But as soon as I moved, the car swerved right in front of me. My foot slammed on the brakes, my heart racing, but there was no way to go around. It was like the car was daring me to try. It sat there for a moment, then slowly moved forward. I thought maybe it was just some confused driver, but when I tried to pass again, it did the same thing. Cut me off. That's when I knew this wasn't normal. I backed off, giving it some space. But there was no escaping that feeling in the pit of my stomach. The feeling that someone was watching me. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The car was unlike anything I'd ever seen. No logos, no dents. Just a dark sedan, too smooth, too deliberate. I couldn't make out the driver. It was just a silhouette behind the tinted windows, and that only made it worse. Something was unnerving about it, like I was being tested or toyed with. I tried to stay calm. I kept my eyes on the road, but the tension was building. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I stop? Should I call someone? But I couldn't get a signal. There was no service on this stretch of road. No way to reach out for help. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was overreacting. But then 2 miles down the road, I saw it again. The sedan parked right in the middle of the road. No hazards, no reason to stop. Just sitting there, waiting. I slammed my hand against the steering wheel, cursing under my breath. This wasn't normal. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. They were waiting for me. I backed off, giving it space, but it didn't move. The road ahead was empty, just miles of dark nothingness. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't stop here. I couldn't let it block me again. I needed to move. I slowly eased the car around it, keeping my distance. And as I passed, the car shifted, following me at a pace that matched mine. Slowly, deliberately, watching, like it knew I was trying to get away. I pressed my foot down harder on the gas. The engine roared and I pulled ahead. I glanced in the rearview mirror only to see the sedan keeping pace. It wasn't speeding up or slowing down, it was staying with me. And no matter what I did, it seemed like the sedan was always a step behind, like it was waiting for me to make a mistake. The wind whipped against the windows as the car shook slightly from the acceleration. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I was so close to losing it. There had to be something wrong. But it wasn't just a car anymore. It was something else. It was a predator, and I was its prey. I looked ahead and saw the gas station in the distance. My heart skipped a beat. I had to make it there. The road was narrow and the distance seemed endless, but I focused on that sign glowing in the distance. My only chance at safety. I swerved into the parking lot, tires screeching, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I threw the car into park without even thinking. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. I glanced at my rearview mirror, but the sedan was gone. I exhaled in relief, but it didn't last. I stepped out of the car, my legs shaky. The night air was cold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced around. No sign of the sedan, but I kept my eyes on the road, waiting. The gas station clerk was inside, half asleep, but something in the way he looked at me made me uneasy. "Everything all right, man?" he asked, barely looking up. "Yeah, just tired," I muttered, trying to act calm. But I couldn't stop looking out the window. My stomach was in knots. I kept thinking I was being watched. Was someone still out there? Were they waiting? I wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion or something else, but I couldn't shake the fear gnawing at me. Then, just as I was about to go back to the car, I saw it. The sedan. It had returned, slowly creeping down the road, but this time it was closer. Way too close. It rolled past the gas station, creeping along the shoulder as though it were studying me. I could see it in the reflection of the glass, dark tinted windows, a figure inside sitting perfectly still. I couldn't make out his face, but I could see enough to know it wasn't random. He was waiting for something. The car didn't stop at the station. It just kept going. I watched as it disappeared into the night, my hands trembling. I stood there frozen for a moment, unable to move. "Who the hell was that?" I muttered to myself, still in shock. The clerk looked up, squinting at the window. "That guy with you?" "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "I don't know who that was." For a moment, the clerk just stared at me, then gave a low whistle, clearly disturbed. "He comes around here sometimes. Weird guy. Doesn't stop for anything. Just drives by. People talk about him. Real quiet. Never anyone else in the car." I looked back out the window. The sedan had already disappeared. I couldn't explain it. But I knew one thing. I was not staying in this gas station any longer. Not tonight. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I just needed to get away from here. I walked back to my car, but the uneasy feeling didn't leave. I started the engine, pulled out of the lot, and drove. But as I turned onto the road, I couldn't help but glance at the rearview mirror. The sedan wasn't there, at least not yet. I kept driving for miles, feeling like the road ahead was endless. My hands were sweating and my mind wouldn't stop racing. I couldn't stop thinking about that guy. Who was he? What did he want? And why did he keep following me? It wasn't long before the roads became even darker, the headlights from the car barely cutting through the dense fog. It was like everything I saw was swallowed up by the night. The silence was deafening, except for the steady hum of the tires and my racing heartbeat. Every time I passed a crossroads, every time I passed an empty car parked along the shoulder, I felt that rush of panic. Was I being followed again? Was it them? Was this all a setup? I looked at the clock on my dashboard. It was nearing 3 a.m. My eyes were heavy, my eyelids fighting to stay open, but I couldn't stop driving. I didn't feel safe. There was a bridge ahead, and for some reason, it felt important. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about that bridge. It didn't feel right. I couldn't explain it, but I had to cross it. I had to. When I reached the bridge, I slowed down. It was long, dark, and completely isolated. The kind of place where no one would hear you scream. I had almost reached the end of the bridge when my headlights flickered. The engine sputtered for a moment before it roared back to life. I muttered under my breath, trying to shake off the dread that suddenly settled in my chest. That's when I saw it. The sedan. It was parked at the far side of the bridge, just barely visible in the fog. The same car, the same man. The engine of my car growled as I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal. I didn't care how fast I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to keep going, keep driving, and never stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I crossed into the next town. I kept driving until I found a brightly lit 24-hour diner. My hands were still shaking, my chest tight with fear, but I finally pulled into a parking spot and took a breath. I got out of the car, walked inside, and sat down, my mind still reeling. Now, I sat in that diner, staring into the bottom of my cup of coffee, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My nerves were still shot, and every passing car outside the window had my heart racing. Every flicker of light, every shadow that moved just out of my peripheral vision made me think of the sedan, the driver, the strange feeling that I was being hunted, but I couldn't understand why. The waitress behind the counter noticed my discomfort and offered a polite smile, but I could see the concern in her eyes. I knew she could tell something was wrong. I felt like I was on edge, like any moment I could be dragged back into whatever nightmare this had turned into. "Hey," she said, her voice soft. "You okay? You don't look so good." I tried to force a smile, but I'm sure it came out shaky. "Yeah, just long night. Been driving for hours, a lot of weird things going on." She nodded as if she understood, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was sizing me up, like she knew something I didn't. I looked at the clock on the diner wall. Nearly 4 a.m. now. The place was empty except for me and a couple of truckers in the corner booth, their voices low as they talked about the weather. For a second, the normalcy of it all almost lulled me into a false sense of safety. But I couldn't let my guard down. Not tonight. I glanced outside, my eyes scanning the street, the quiet, empty stretch of road. No sign of the sedan, no headlights creeping up behind me. Still, I couldn't shake the tension in my chest. It felt like the calm before a storm. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that the sedan had just been some weird coincidence, some strange random encounter, but deep down I knew better. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As I sat there, I started replaying everything in my head. The way the car had moved so deliberately, the way the driver never seemed to hurry, the way I was being watched as if someone was enjoying my fear. It didn't make sense. People don't follow other people like that, not unless there's a reason. The waitress came back with a refill of coffee and set it down in front of me. I gave her a half-hearted smile, but my mind was elsewhere. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her voice almost teasing. But there was something behind it. I couldn't place it. "I think I have," I muttered, more to myself than to her. She raised an eyebrow, waiting for me to continue. I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping to a whisper. "About an hour ago, I was driving through the middle of nowhere, and I got followed by this weird car. It kept cutting me off, following me like it was trying to get me to stop. I thought I was just losing it, but it didn't stop. It followed me to a gas station." The waitress's expression shifted. It wasn't a concern anymore. It was something else. something I couldn't quite read. "That's strange," she said, a little too casually, but she didn't press any further. Instead, she turned back toward the counter. I watched her walk away, but I didn't feel like I had a sense of closure. The puzzle pieces of the night didn't fit together. The more I thought about it, the more surreal it seemed. Maybe I was just exhausted, or maybe something else was at play. But my gut was telling me that something wasn't right. I finished my coffee in silence, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Was it just a coincidence? Or had I narrowly escaped something much worse? I'd seen enough strange things over the years to know that sometimes there's no clear explanation. Some things just happen, and trying to understand them will drive you crazy. I paid the waitress and left the diner, stepping out into the night. The cool air felt sharp against my skin, but it didn't do anything to clear my head. The car was still on my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark sedan creeping up behind me, its headlights casting long shadows in the rearview mirror. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched again. But I didn't know who to trust or where to turn. I drove for another hour, just trying to put miles between myself and whatever that car had been. But the more I drove, the more I realized I wasn't really running from the car. I was running from the questions, the fear, the uncertainty that had gripped me since the first time I saw it. I turned the radio on, trying to drown out my thoughts, but the static only made things worse. It felt like the radio waves were trying to send me a message, some warning that I wasn't getting. I kept turning the dial, flipping from station to station, but every channel was the same. Silence, static, the endless hum of the road. By the time I made it back to a more familiar area, the sun was starting to rise, the first light of dawn creeping through the trees. My mind was exhausted, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't over, that something was waiting for me just out of sight. I didn't know if I'd ever find out who that man in the sedan was or why he'd been following me, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to be driving those roads alone again anytime soon. Whatever had happened that night, it was a reminder that the world doesn't always make sense. Sometimes, the things that chase us are out there waiting, and we can't outrun them forever. Maybe it was just a random encounter, or maybe, in some twisted way, it was meant to be. But one thing was certain. I wouldn't be forgetting that night anytime soon. And every time I pass an empty stretch of road, I'll wonder, was it just a coincidence? Or something much darker? If you've ever had a moment like this, a time when you felt like something was watching you, following you, or maybe you just felt that deep, nagging unease, I want to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments below. And if this tale made you rethink your next night drive, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs a reminder to stay vigilant on the roads. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another terrifying tale. Trust your instincts, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the scariest things don't show up in your rearview mirror until it's too late. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.